In the coal country of South Yorkshire, where the ground has been hollowed out for 300 years, there stands a house that should not exist. Not because it is too old, not because it is too grand, but because in 1946 the British government tried to destroy it. They did not send soldiers, they did not drop bombs, they sent bulldozers, they sent excavators. They tore up 300 years of gardens, ripped out ancient beach avenues, and dug open cast coal mines so close to the walls that the foundations began to crack. The coal they extracted was inferior. Everyone knew it. The destruction was the point. Wentworth Woodhouse has the longest facade of any house in Europe. 606 feet of pale Palladian stone stretch across the South Yorkshire landscape like a statement carved into the earth itself. More than 300 rooms, 5 miles of corridors. At its peak, over 1,000 staff members worked here. An invisible army moving through service tunnels and back staircases, keeping the machinery of aristocratic life running so smoothly that the family above rarely saw them at all. The house contains more square footage than Buckingham Palace. It was built to be seen from miles away. A declaration of power so absolute that even the hills seemed to bend toward it. But Wentworth Woodhouse was not built for beauty. It was not built for comfort. It was built from spite. And spite, as it turns out, is an excellent foundation for architecture, but a terrible one for survival. This is the dark story of Britain's largest private home. A house born from a family feud so bitter, it spawned a rival castle 6 miles away. A house that witnessed changeling scandals, secret lovers, plane crashes, and political revenge. A house where the coal miners who destroyed the gardens in 1946 were the great-grandchildren of the miners who had made the family rich in the first place. To understand what Wentworth Woodhouse really is, you have to understand what it cost, not in money, in something harder to measure. The question that haunts this place is simple. What happens when a family builds a monument to their own greatness and then history decides they were wrong? The story begins not with construction, but with inheritance. In 1695, the second Earl of Strafford died without children, and the Wentworth fortune had to go somewhere. The estate, the title, the power that came with centuries of accumulated land, all of it needed an heir. There were 2 candidates. Thomas Watson was the nephew through the female line. Thomas Wentworth was the cousin through the male line. By the conventions of the time, Wentworth should have inherited everything. He was the man. He carried the family name. He had spent his life assuming that Wentworth Woodhouse would one day be his. He was wrong. The inheritance went to Thomas Watson instead. Through some quirk of the will, some legal manoeuvring lost to history, the estate passed down the female line. Thomas Wentworth received the secondary title of Baron Raby. He received some money. He did not receive the house. He did not receive the land. He did not receive the future he had been promised. What he received instead was rage. Thomas Wentworth did not accept his dispossession quietly. He spent the next decades rebuilding himself, earning his own fortune, cultivating his own political connections, and eventually securing his own earldom. But he never forgot what had been taken from him. When he had enough money to make a statement, he made one that could be seen from Wentworth Woodhouse itself. 6 miles away, on a hill with clear sightlines to his cousin's estate, Thomas Wentworth purchased Stainborough Hall and transformed it into Wentworth Castle. He expanded the building, he elaborated the gardens, he constructed follies and monuments across the landscape, and according to family legend, he made absolutely certain that his new castle had exactly 1 more room than the house that should have been his. The feud had been architectural from the beginning. Thomas Watson, who had inherited Wentworth Woodhouse, lived there quietly for years. He did not engage with his cousin's provocations. He did not try to outbuild him. But when Thomas Watson died in 1723, his son inherited both the estate and the rivalry. Thomas Watson Wentworth was not a quiet man. He looked across the valley at his cousin's castle and decided that the original Wentworth Woodhouse, a Jacobean manor of red brick and modest ambitions, was no longer sufficient. If his cousin wanted a competition, he would give him one. He hired architects, he drew up plans, and he began constructing what would become the largest private home in British history. The western front came first, a Baroque facade of warm red brick that spoke to the Stuart past the family was trying to leave behind. But Watson Wentworth was not satisfied. Before the western front was even finished, he commissioned a second facade, this one facing east, built in an entirely different style. Where the west was Baroque, the east was Palladian. Where the west was brick, the east was stone. 606 feet of classical columns and symmetrical windows, designed to make everyone who saw it understand exactly how much money the Wentworths had and exactly how willing they were to spend it. The result was a house with two faces, two facades built back to back, representing two different architectural philosophies, two different statements of intent. The Baroque West looked backward, to tradition and inheritance. The Palladian East looked forward, to reason and power, and the Whig politics that would make the Wentworths one of the most influential families in England. Thomas Watson Wentworth became the first Marquess of Rockingham. His son, the second Marquess, would serve twice as Prime Minister. The house was never just a house, it was a campaign headquarters. It was a political machine. It was proof that the Wentworths who had inherited through the female line were more powerful, more wealthy, and more important than the Wentworths who had been passed over. The feud that had begun with a disputed will became encoded in stone and mortar, visible from miles away, impossible to ignore. By the time the second Marquess of Rockingham died in 1782, Wentworth Woodhouse had achieved its purpose. The rival castle across the valley had been eclipsed. The family's political power was at its peak. The Prime Minister of England had governed from these rooms. But the second Marquess died without children, and the estate passed sideways again, this time to his nephew, the fourth Earl Fitzwilliam. The Fitzwilliams would hold Wentworth Woodhouse for the next 200 years. They would expand the estate to 15,000 acres. They would employ over 1,000 staff. They would host kings and queens and shape the politics of the nation. And they would discover what the original builders could not have known, that a house built from spite requires constant fuel, that rivalry is expensive, that the coal beneath the ground would make them rich, and then, in the end, destroy everything they had built on top of it. The Fitzwilliam fortune came from coal. The South Yorkshire coalfield stretched beneath their estate, and for generations the family extracted wealth from the darkness below while living in splendour above. The relationship was straightforward. The miners dug, the Fitzwilliams prospered. The house grew more elaborate with each generation, more rooms, more staff, more gardens, more fountains, more of everything money could buy. All of it was paid for by men working in tunnels beneath the earth who would never see the chandeliers their labour had purchased. At its peak, Wentworth Woodhouse required an army to function. The household staff numbered in the hundreds: footmen and butlers, housemaids and kitchen maids, gardeners and grooms and gamekeepers. The estate operated its own farms, its own workshops, its own infrastructure. There were service corridors running through the house like arteries, designed so that servants could move from room to room without ever being seen by the family. There were bells in every room connected to a panel in the servants' hall, each bell with a different tone so the staff would know exactly which room required attention. There were coal-fired boilers in the basement, feeding steam through miles of pipes to heat 300 rooms through the Yorkshire winter. The family lived above. The servants lived below, and beside and behind, in a parallel world of institutional corridors and narrow staircases. The two worlds intersected only when service was required. a footman delivering tea, a maid lighting a fire, a butler announcing a guest. The rest of the time, the machinery of the house operated invisibly, like the coal mines beneath the estate, producing comfort and luxury without ever intruding on the people who benefited from it. In 1912, King George V and Queen Mary visited Wentworth Woodhouse. The preparations took months. 76 bedrooms were made ready for the royal party and their attendants. The staff worked around the clock, polishing silver, pressing linens, rehearsing the precise choreography of royal service. When the king and queen arrived, tens of thousands of people lined the roads to see them. The visit was a triumph. The Fitzwilliams had demonstrated that their house could accommodate royalty in appropriate splendour, that their wealth was sufficient, that their position was secure. The 7th Earl Fitzwilliam, who hosted that royal visit, was known as Billy. He had been born in a remote cabin on the Canadian frontier, far from the splendour he would inherit. From the moment of his birth, questions followed him. His father, the Viscount Milton, was the black sheep of the family, an epileptic who had been sent away from England to avoid embarrassment. The birth in Canada was unusual, and the circumstances were unclear. When Billy eventually inherited the earldom, family members came forward with accusations that would shadow him for the rest of his life. They called him a changeling. They claimed he had been swapped at birth with an unwanted girl. They argued that he had no right to the title, no right to the estate, no right to any of it. The case went to court, lawyers were hired, evidence was presented. In the end, Billy Fitzwilliam won. He was declared the legitimate heir. But no conclusive evidence was ever produced either way. The question of whether the 7th Earl was truly a Fitzwilliam, truly entitled to Wentworth Woodhouse, was never definitively answered. He simply won the legal argument and carried on. Billy modernised the house. He installed electricity in 1904. He added central heating and running water, bringing the 19th century estate into the 20th century. But he could not modernise away the questions about his birth, and he could not modernise away what was coming. In 1914, the world that had made Wentworth Woodhouse possible began to end. The First World War killed a generation of young aristocrats. The men who should have inherited estates like Wentworth Woodhouse died in the trenches of France and Belgium. Death duties, introduced in 1894 and raised repeatedly during and after the war, began to drain the fortunes that had accumulated over centuries. The servant class that had made great houses function discovered that there were other options, other jobs, other lives that did not require living in someone else's basement. The agricultural income that had supplemented coal revenues declined. The costs of maintaining 300 rooms did not. Billy Fitzwilliam died in 1943, and his son Peter became the 8th Earl. Peter was everything his father had not been allowed to be. He was glamorous, he was reckless, he was a war hero who had served with distinction. He was also a drinker, a gambler, and a womanizer who was rumoured to have fathered illegitimate children with local women from the mining villages. The coal miners' daughters were apparently not off limits to the Earl who employed their fathers. But Peter's most dangerous entanglement was not with a miner's daughter. It was with Kathleen Kennedy. Kik was the sister of the future President of the United States. She had married into the British aristocracy during the war, becoming the Marchioness of Hartington when she wed the heir to the Duke of Devonshire. 4 months after the wedding, her husband was killed by a German sniper in Belgium. Kik was a widow at 24, a Catholic in Protestant England, a Kennedy in a world that did not yet know what that name would mean. She met Peter Fitzwilliam in 1946. He was married. She was still technically in mourning. Neither of them cared. The affair was passionate and public enough that both families became concerned. The Kennedys, devoutly Catholic, were horrified that Kik would consider marrying a divorced man. The Fitzwilliams were alarmed that Peter would abandon his wife and children for an American widow. Pressure was applied from both sides. It made no difference. In May 1948, Peter and Kik flew to the south of France for a holiday. They were planning to meet with Kik's father, Joseph Kennedy, to seek his blessing for their marriage. They never arrived. Over the Rhone Valley, their small plane flew into a thunderstorm. The pilot lost control. The plane crashed into a mountainside. Peter Fitzwilliam and Kathleen Kennedy were both killed instantly. The scandal was suppressed with remarkable efficiency. Three of the most powerful families in the Anglo-American world, the Kennedys, the Fitzwilliams, and the Cavendishes, closed ranks to obscure the nature of the relationship. Press coverage was minimal. Questions were not asked. Peter Fitzwilliam was buried at Wentworth Woodhouse. Kathleen Kennedy was buried in England, far from her family, in a grave her mother refused to visit for years. But before Peter died, before the plane crash that ended his affair with a Kennedy, something else happened to Wentworth Woodhouse. Something that would prove more destructive than any scandal. Something that would crack the foundations the family had built over 2 centuries. In February 1946, the Labour government of Clement Attlee announced that it would requisition the grounds of Wentworth Woodhouse for open-cast coal mining. Emmanuel Shinwell, the Minister of Fuel and Power, ordered that 110 acres of gardens and parkland be dug up. The 300-year-old Beach Avenue would be destroyed. The lawns that had hosted royal visits would become pits. The excavations would come within yards of the house itself. Peter Fitzwilliam fought the order. He negotiated with the government. He offered the estate to the National Trust if they would stop the mining. Nothing worked. The bulldozers arrived. The gardens were torn apart. Over the next several years, more than 130,000 tons of coal were extracted from what had been the grounds of England's largest private home. The coal was low quality. Everyone knew it. The seams beneath the gardens were thin and difficult to work. The extraction was inefficient and expensive. The mining made no economic sense, which is why many historians have concluded that economics was not the point. Emmanuel Shinwell was a Labour politician who had spent his career fighting for workers' rights. The Fitzwilliams were aristocrats who had spent their lives benefiting from workers' labour. The coal miners who dug up the gardens of Wentworth Woodhouse were the descendants of the miners who had made the Fitzwilliam fortune. For generations, those miners had lived in villages owned by the estate, worked in pits owned by the estate, and generated profits that had paid for the chandeliers and the paintings and the 300 rooms they would never enter. Now, finally, the workers had power, and some of them wanted to use that power to settle old scores. Catherine Bailey, who wrote the definitive history of Wentworth Woodhouse, calls what happened political revenge. The destruction of the gardens was not about coal. It was about class. It was about centuries of accumulated resentment finally finding an outlet. It was about a Labour government showing the aristocracy that the old rules no longer applied. The mining destabilized the foundations of the house. Cracks appeared in the walls. The damage would take decades to assess and longer to repair. When the excavations finally ended, the grounds that had taken 300 years to create were gone. In their place were pits and spoil heaps and scars that would take generations to heal. Peter Fitzwilliam died 2 years after the mining began. His estate was crippled by death duties. The contents of Wentworth Woodhouse, accumulated over centuries, were sold at auction. Paintings, furniture, silver, all of it was dispersed to pay the government its share. The family that had once employed 1,000 people could no longer afford to maintain the house they had built to demonstrate their greatness. In 1949, the year after Peter's death, his Aunt Lady Mabel Fitzwilliam championed a solution that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. Wentworth Woodhouse would be leased as an educational facility. A teacher training college would occupy the state rooms. The Marble Saloon, where Anna Pavlova had danced for King George V, would become a gymnasium. The Whistle Jacket Room, named for the famous painting by George Stubbs that had hung there for 2 centuries, would become a dance studio. The house that had been built to intimidate, to impress, to demonstrate the superiority of its owners, was now filled with young women in athletic clothing learning to teach physical education. The transformation was complete. The aristocracy had not been overthrown. They had simply been made irrelevant. The educational institutions occupied Wentworth Woodhouse until 1988. Sheffield City Polytechnic was the last tenant. When they left, the house was sold to private owners who struggled to maintain it. The building passed through multiple hands over the next 3 decades. Decay accelerated. The roof leaked. The foundations continued to shift. The damage from the mining in the 1940s had never been properly addressed. In 2017, the Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust purchased the estate for £7 million. They inherited a house that required at least £100 million in repairs. The roof alone needed £25 million. The stabilisation of the foundations, still suffering from the mining 70 years earlier, would cost millions more. The trust began fundraising. They opened the house to visitors. They applied for grants and donations and anything else that might help save the largest private home in Britain from collapse. Today, Wentworth Woodhouse stands as something between a museum and a construction site. Scaffolding covers portions of the facade. Restoration work proceeds room by room, dependent on funding that arrives unpredictably. Visitors can tour portions of the house, walking through state rooms that once hosted prime ministers and kings, now empty of their original furnishings, decorated with information panels explaining what used to be there. The Marble Saloon is no longer a gymnasium. The Whistle Jacket Room no longer holds the painting it was named for. That painting, George Stubbs's masterpiece of a rearing horse against a plain background, was sold in 1997 and now hangs in the National Gallery in London. Visitors to Wentworth Woodhouse can see a reproduction. The original is 50 miles away, owned by the nation, accessible to anyone with the price of a train ticket. In some ways, this is the appropriate ending. The painting that once demonstrated private wealth now belongs to the public. The house that was built to exclude is now open to anyone who pays the admission fee. The transformation that began with the teacher training college has continued to its logical conclusion. Wentworth Woodhouse is no longer a home. It is a heritage site, a monument to something that no longer exists. But the story is not quite that simple. While Wentworth Woodhouse was being destroyed and restored and transformed into a tourist attraction, something else was happening to wealth in Britain. The aristocracy declined. The great houses emptied or opened to the public. Death duties consumed the fortunes that had accumulated over centuries. The visible, architectural, land-based wealth of the old ruling class was systematically dismantled. And in its place, new fortunes arose. Fortunes that did not require 600 feet of Palladian facade to demonstrate their existence. Fortunes held in shell companies and offshore accounts and assets that could not be photographed or toured or requisitioned for coal mining. The modern billionaire does not build houses like Wentworth Woodhouse. The modern billionaire buys apartments in multiple cities, owns shares in companies registered in jurisdictions that do not require disclosure, and structures their wealth to be invisible in ways that the Fitzwilliams could never have imagined. The Duke of Westminster, whose family fortune derives from London real estate, is worth approximately £10 billion. He does not live in a house with 300 rooms. He does not employ 1,000 staff. His wealth is not displayed on a hilltop in South Yorkshire for anyone to see and resent and eventually dig up out of spite. His wealth exists in legal structures and financial instruments that most people will never understand, let alone be able to attack. The Fitzwilliams were destroyed because their wealth was visible, because it was land and buildings and coal mines that could be taxed and requisitioned and nationalized. When the political wind shifted, everything they owned was right there, impossible to hide, impossible to move, impossible to protect. The mining of the Wentworth Woodhouse gardens was an act of class warfare. But it was only possible because the Fitzwilliam wealth was physical, tangible, and anchored to a specific piece of ground. Modern wealth has learned from that example. Modern wealth is liquid. Modern wealth is mobile. Modern wealth exists in forms that cannot be torn up by bulldozers or subjected to death duties or open to the public as a heritage site. The billionaires did not disappear when the aristocracy declined. They simply learned to hide. This is the question that Wentworth Woodhouse poses to anyone who visits, not whether the house is beautiful. It is, not whether the restoration is worthwhile. That depends on your priorities, but whether we have actually become more equal or whether we have simply become worse at seeing inequality. The Fitzwilliams displayed their wealth because display was the point. The house was a statement. The gardens were a statement. The 1,000 employees and the royal visits and the Prime Minister governing from the staterooms were all statements about who mattered and who did not. When that display became politically untenable, when the miners' descendants finally had enough power to tear it down, they did. The destruction of the gardens was ugly and vindictive and economically irrational. It was also, in its way, democratic. The people who had been excluded from Wentworth Woodhouse for 300 years finally got to express their opinion about it. But what do we do with wealth we cannot see? How do we debate fortunes that exist in legal structures we cannot understand? How do we hold accountable billionaires whose holdings are distributed across dozens of jurisdictions and hundreds of corporate entities? The Fitzwilliams could be attacked because they were visible. The modern super rich have made themselves invisible. And invisibility, it turns out, is much better protection than 600 feet of stone. Wentworth Woodhouse is being restored. The roof is being repaired. The foundations are being stabilized. The house that was built from spite and destroyed by revenge is being brought back to life as a heritage attraction, a wedding venue, a location for film production. The Preservation Trust is doing admirable work with limited resources. In another generation, the scars from 1940s mining may finally be healed. But the world that created Wentworth Woodhouse is gone. The landed aristocracy that built great houses as statements of permanent power has been replaced by a plutocracy that builds nothing at all, or builds in places where no one can see. The coal mines that funded the Fitzwilliam fortune have closed. The miners' descendants work in other industries now, or do not work at all. The political conflicts that led to the destruction of the gardens seem almost quaint compared to the inequalities of the present day. In the end, Wentworth Woodhouse is a monument to visibility, to a time when the rich wanted to be seen, when they built their wealth into the landscape, when they dared anyone to challenge them. The challenge came. The gardens were destroyed. The house was emptied and leased and sold and nearly lost. And somewhere in an office building that looks like every other office building, in a jurisdiction that specializes in discretion, the new aristocracy manages its wealth in ways that will never show up on a hilltop. Never employ 1,000 servants, never host a king, and never be vulnerable to a minister with a grudge and a fleet of bulldozers. The question is whether that is better, whether invisible wealth is preferable to the kind that could be seen and resented and ultimately attacked, whether we have made progress or simply made inequality harder to find. Wentworth Woodhouse has no answer. It is just a house, the largest private house in Britain, built from spite, maintained by coal, destroyed by politics, and now preserved by charity. It stands in South Yorkshire with its 606 feet of facade, waiting for visitors who want to see how the old world displayed its wealth. The new world does not display anything. That is the lesson. That is what the house teaches if you are willing to learn it. The gardens are growing back. The beech trees Bayeux that were torn out in 1946 have been replaced with new plantings. In another century, they may look like they have always been there. The scars heal, the memory fades, the house remains, beautiful and empty and somehow still angry, still carrying the spite of its creation and the revenge of its destruction into an age that has learned to hide what it has and show nothing at all.